It's gone from bad to worse. He's been caught accepting donations to pay for his wife's dresses. He's been accepting more freebies than any other MP in Parliament.
Lizz Truss just dropped a bombshell on British politics, calling Keir Starmer the worst Prime Minister the UK has ever had. In a fiery speech that left everyone stunned, she didn't hold back, accusing Starmer of leading the country to the brink of disaster. With the UK facing rising energy prices and economic uncertainty, the big question now is, can Starmer turn it around, or is the damage already done?
Very low proportion of the vote. He got in by default because people were unhappy with the Conservatives. They voted Labour. They didn't particularly like him.
Lizz Truss did not mince her words when she recently slammed Keir Starmer, calling him the worst Prime Minister in UK history. This bold and unfiltered accusation has sparked intense conversations across the nation, with many wondering whether she was simply venting frustration or if there's real merit to her claims. What makes her words stand out is not just the harshness of the accusation, but the sense of urgency and seriousness she attached to it. According to Truss, Starmer's leadership is not only failing to meet expectations, but is actively driving the UK toward a disaster from which it may never recover.
Meanwhile, because of their disastrous economic policies, they are cutting payments to old people, just as energy prices are going up here in the UK. So it's a disastrous start for his government.
From the outset, Truss set a grave tone, presenting Starmer as a leader who is woefully unequipped to handle the complexities of governing a nation. She argued that under his leadership, the UK has gone from bad to worse, suffering from a series of missteps and miscalculations that have left the country teetering on the edge of a full-blown crisis. We are on the edge of a crisis from which there may be no return, Truss warned, her voice echoing with a mix of frustration and urgency.
And it's a disaster. Our economy is stagnating. Meanwhile, China is selling us solar panels. I mean, why does that make sense? And the problem is we have a Labour Party now in government who are saying that climate change is more of a threat to the future of the world than China. Now, that simply isn't true.
In your new book, 10 Years to Save the West, you point out that the unelected officials, let's call them the blob if you like, that they can sabotage the policy of an elected government. And why is this the case? Is it because ministers come and go but the officials are there forever? Or is it because too many ministers, elected ministers, just lack the courage to give directions to bureaucrats?
Well, I think the problem in Britain has got much worse, and it got worse during the Blair government because he put in lots of legislation like the Human Rights Act, like the Equality Act, that ended up tying politicians' hands.
What makes her accusation resonate with so many people is the fact that it taps into a growing frustration among a portion of the British public. Many feel that Starmer's government, despite being in power for only a short time, has done little to address the real, pressing issues facing the country. Whether it's the skyrocketing cost of energy, the deteriorating state of public services, or the rising sense of insecurity, Truss painted a picture of a country on the brink of chaos, and she laid the blame squarely at Starmer's feet.
We're saying that climate change is more of a threat to the future of the world than China. Now, that simply isn't true.
One of the key points Truss made in her fiery speech was that Starmer's government seemed unprepared and directionless. According to her, when Labour took power, they did so by default, not because of a wave of enthusiasm or strong policies, but because people were tired of the Conservatives. She suggested that many voters who switched to Labour didn't even particularly like Starmer. They simply wanted change for the sake of it. But instead of delivering real change, Starmer's leadership, in her view, has been marked by indecision, a lack of clear vision, and policies that have only worsened the situation.
I think the problem in Britain has got much worse, and it got worse during the Blair government because he put in lots of legislation like the Human Rights Act, like the Equality Act, that ended up tying politicians' hands. And we weren't brave enough to take on those ideas when we were in government.
Keir Starmer's leadership began under a cloud of controversy and has only deepened as time went on. The early days of his government have been marked by a lack of clear vision, policy, and direction. Many people, including Lizz Truss, have pointed out that Starmer wasn't elected because the public had overwhelming faith in him or his leadership. Instead, his rise to power was largely due to widespread dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party. People were tired of the Tories, and Labour was the only alternative. It's not that Starmer won over the hearts and minds of the electorate. It was more of a case where voters felt they had no other choice.
I am against a windfall tax. I believe it is the wrong thing to be putting companies off investing in the United Kingdom just when we need to be growing the economy.
That's a pretty shaky foundation for any leader, and it seems Starmer's government has struggled to find its footing ever since. His policies, when they're even clear, don't seem to resonate with the needs of the public. Instead of presenting bold ideas or solutions, Starmer's leadership has been characterized by indecision and a reactive stance on most issues. It's like he's playing catch-up rather than taking charge, and that's something Lizz Truss has been quick to highlight.
I'm on the side of people who work hard and do the right thing. That is why we will reverse the national insurance increase, and that is why we will keep corporation tax low.
Adding to this perception of weakness is the scandal surrounding Starmer's acceptance of donations to fund his personal expenses, including paying for his wife's dresses. At a time when many people in the UK are struggling to make ends meet, this kind of behavior understandably didn't sit well with the public. It paints a picture of a leader who is not only out of touch with the realities faced by ordinary citizens, but also someone who seems to be living in his own privileged bubble. While the public is facing rising costs and inflation, Starmer is seen benefiting from political donations to cover luxury expenses. This scandal becomes even more problematic when you consider the harsh economic policies his government has implemented. For example, while energy prices have been soaring, affecting millions of people across the UK, particularly the elderly, Starmer's government has cut payments to the most vulnerable. It's hard to imagine a more tone-deaf response to a national crisis, and Truss wasted no time in calling him out for it. As she pointed out, it's like he's living in a completely different reality from the rest of us. And honestly, she's not wrong. There seems to be a serious disconnect between Starmer's priorities and the issues that are actually affecting people on a daily basis.
Well, it's economic self-harm. It's unilateral economic disarmament. While India and China are building more coal-fired power stations, getting more oil and gas, we in Britain have ended up.
One of the biggest points of contention between Lizz Truss and Keir Starmer has been the way Starmer's government has handled the energy crisis. As energy prices have continued to climb, the British public has found themselves paying more and more just to heat their homes and keep the lights on. But instead of offering solutions that could bring some relief, Starmer's government has been adamantly opposed to policies that might actually help, like fracking. Fracking, while controversial, is seen by many, including Truss, as a way to make energy more affordable and accessible in the UK. Truss has been vocal in her criticism of Starmer's refusal to explore this option. From her perspective, it's a clear example of the government putting ideology over practicality. The UK has the resources to ease the burden of energy costs on its citizens, but the Labour government refuses to take action. Truss has described this as nothing short of economic self-harm.
We've just closed our last steel works, producing virgin steel because energy is unaffordable. The British government is refusing to do fracking.
It's hard to argue with her logic here. While the UK is shutting down industries and refusing to tap into its own natural resources, countries like China and India are doing the exact opposite. They're continuing to grow and strengthen their economies by expanding their industrial output and energy production. Meanwhile, in the UK, Starmer's government is overseeing the closure of vital industries, like the last steelworks that produced virgin steel. For Truss, this is a major failure in leadership. She's made it clear that Starmer's policies aren't just misguided, they're actively harmful to the country's long-term economic stability. As she put it, it's like we're closing up shop while the rest of the world moves forward. How does that make any sense? and she's not alone in feeling this way. There's a growing sense among many that the Labour government is more focused on idealistic goals, like achieving net zero, rather than addressing the immediate concerns of everyday people. Another area where Liz Truss has been highly critical of Starmer's government is in its approach to global security. According to Truss, the Labour government's priorities are completely out of touch with the real threats facing the UK. Instead of focusing on the growing dangers posed by countries like Russia and China, Starmer's government seems more concerned with virtue signaling and symbolic gestures.
China is selling us solar panels. I mean, why does that make sense? And the problem is we have a Labour Party now in government who are saying that climate change is more of a threat to the future of the world than China.
One of the examples Truss gave was the recent decision by Foreign Minister David Lammy to fly the bisexual pride flag outside of government offices. Now, it's not that Truss or anyone else necessarily has a problem with supporting LGBTQ+ rights, but her point is that these kinds of gestures seem to be taking precedence over much more pressing issues. While the world faces real dangers, our government is focusing on all the wrong things. How is this leadership? She asked. It's a fair question. At a time when global security threats are at an all-time high, should the focus really be on climate change and identity politics? Truss also highlighted how Starmer's government has prioritized climate change initiatives at the expense of national security. While there's no doubt that climate change is an important issue, Truss argued that it shouldn't come at the cost of weakening the UK's global standing. In her view, countries like China and Russia are taking advantage of the West's obsession with reducing carbon emissions, using it as an opportunity to expand their own influence and power. She sees Starmer's climate policies as part of a broader strategy of unilateral disarmament, both economically and geopolitically.
You know, the disenfranchisement of ordinary people as the waves and waves of illegal migration hitting the UK. We watch it in Australia. We know it can be stopped.
For Truss, this focus on secondary issues is emblematic of a larger problem within Starmer's government. It's out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people. While global security is becoming more and more precarious, the government is fixated on symbolic gestures that do little to address the real challenges the country is facing. Whether it's the energy crisis, the state of the economy, or the threats posed by China and Russia, Truss believes that Starmer's government has its head in the clouds while the ground is crumbling beneath their feet. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.